Right. We got it figured out. We're live. Sorry, folks. Sorry, folks. We just had this little technical difficulties going on. We were trying a bunch of different stuff. We finally we took the button off that was supposed to be on and switched it around, and now everything is good. So appreciate everybody for hanging out. Sorry about that, but we are up and rolling, and we got a good show planned for you tonight. So let's just dive right in, man. Let's just dive right in. I was kind of curious on how you, like, the path you went down to get to be the B.A.S.S. conservation director. I mean, give us a little background about how you got from point A to where you're at right now.
Okay, well, just so everybody that's listening knows, we're going to go till about midnight because we got such a late start.
I was thinking 1 a.m.
Okay.
Right, let's split the difference. 12:30. My wife will start worrying about midnight. So
there you go. All right. Well, at first, let me thank you guys for putting up with my technology issues I had on this end, and hopefully problem. We got it all straightened out. To answer your question, I was a fishery biologist for the Oklahoma Wildlife Department for 30 years. And during a good portion of that as a research biologist, I worked on some research projects related to bass tournaments and got involved with B.A.S.S. kind of as I called myself an unpaid consultant. Working with the tournament staff on fish care. And they started bringing me to the Bassmaster Classic back in like 1993 and have been to every classic since then. So about 10 years ago, I retired from the state job. And that's when B.A.S.S hired me as the conservation director. And that was kind of just a timing thing. My predecessor at B.A.S.S was ready to retire, and I was ready to retire from the state, so the timing was just right. And that's when I took the job as the conservation director for B.A.S.S. But I've been working with B.A.S.S, with the company in some form or fashion for a long time. I wrote a bass biology column for Bass Times for off and on for about 20 years. And then again, like I say, with the fish care, the consulting kind of stuff on tournament issues, that just sort of naturally led into the job that I have now, that I've been going on 10 years now.
So what exactly do you do? I mean, what's your job? It's a mystery to me. I mean, I hear the title, and I've read several articles about you and stuff, but I'm just curious about what your daily activities are.
Yeah, my job really has three components. If you're familiar with the Bass Nation, our state chapters that we have all over the country, each one of those states has a state conservation director who's just a volunteer, just a bass angler that wants to help take care of the resource. I work with them on like state and local issues, because most of them don't have a lot of training in biology or working with government or policy, that kind of stuff. So I help them kind of navigate through some of the challenges and trying to get them to work with their state fish and wildlife agencies so that they can tackle some of those local problems. Another part of my job, just like I mentioned a minute ago, is working within B.A.S.S, the company, with our tournament staff at all of the levels that we have, whether it's high school, college, Bass Nation, the Bassmaster Opens, or the elite tournaments. Our tournament staff that works all of those tournaments, I try to work with them primarily on fish care issues and making sure that they're doing everything that they need to be doing to keep those fish healthy so we can release as many as possible at the end of the day. The third component of my job is the politics and the policy issues. B.A.S.S has had a seat on a number of different national boards and councils for decades as a voice for anglers. And so I'm on several of those. I represent B.A.S.S, the company, but I also kind of represent B.A.S anglers and kind of on the broader scale, most all fishermen. And a couple of the councils that I'm on, I represent like freshwater anglers, not just bass fishermen. But those typically are national level policy. You're dealing with federal agencies and with Congress and that kind of thing. So those are kind of the three components of my job.
Yeah. So we've had Mark Menendez on here several times, one of our favorite guests, and I know he's done a lot of work with AFCO and just on the invasive species like the Asian carp that were all over the place. Anything that touches basically the Mississippi River is going to have carp in it for the most part. I know he spent time lobbying in Congress and spent time in Washington, D.C. And is that something that you do too on occasion?
On occasion, yes. In fact, I was in D.C. about 3 weeks ago. Some of the committees, the councils that I'm on, occasionally we will go to Capitol Hill and talk to legislators about specific bills that we want to get them to support or not support, depending on what the topic is. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not, so I don't have, any of that sort of background and I don't want it. We work with other organizations that have offices and headquarters in Washington, like the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation or the American Sport Fishing Association. They have lobbyists. They have people whose job is to keep track of what's going on in Congress. So what we do a lot of times is they take the lead on some of these issues. And when we get to that point where we need support from the rank and file members, they issue a call to action. That's when we'll contact our B.A.S.S membership and say, hey, write your congressman. Here's the issue. Here's what you need to know about it. And here's how to make a difference. And so a lot of times that's, we're kind of the horsepower in some of those issues, whereas somebody else is up there, raises the flag, and now we're trying to get the troops to follow.
So do you like doing that? I mean, that's
no.
I wouldn't think so, man. That wouldn't be me at all.
That was a quick answer.
It is, and I am so grateful that there are people that love it and that live that policy world in Washington, or even at state capitals, because we have, like through the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, they have somebody in every state that keeps track of what's going on in your state legislature in relation to hunting and fishing and wildlife, that sort of thing. And I'm glad, very, very glad, grateful that we have people that do that to keep track of that sort of thing, and then so that we don't have to deal as much with the politics, because it's definitely not a fun part of the job from my perspective. But there are people that just love doing that. They love that type of situation, and I'm glad that we have partners that do that sort of thing. Now, and that's something that's changed over the decades. 30, 40, 50 years ago, probably, I guess closer to 50 now, Ray Scott, a lot of people have heard stories about how he would sue companies for polluting, and he would go to Congress and he would testify about this bill or that bill. Back then, these other organizations didn't exist. And so Ray was having to carry the banner. But that's kind of evolved over the years to where now we have other organizations in Washington that that's what their job is. They make it their job to deal in that policy world. And we can be a supporting player. B.A.S.S for the most part it's a media company. Everybody thinks we're a tournament organization, but really in the grand scheme of things, B.A.S is a media company with the TV show and the magazine and the website, the live streaming, that sort of thing. Content is what we try to put out. And through that membership part of B.A.S, the 500,000+ members that we have, we are the largest membership fishing organization in the world. And so we have a lot of potential there to get the vote out, so to speak, when these issues come up. And so what my job is then to try to take those policy issues that our partners have identified and make sure that our rank and file membership and our media platforms get that message out when when we have those, write your congressman kind of moments.
I like the story of, you mentioned Ray Scott, and I think the history of bass and then bass tournaments as it relates to Ray Scott is pretty interesting because, back in the day, I think it was a 10 fish limit. Guys, they could care less about fish care for the most part. And then they knocked it down to, I believe, 7 fish. And then it became the catch and release got put in there somewhere because the story I got, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Ray had either had some friends that were trout fishermen that practiced a lot of catch and release and stuff. And, they're real fanatical about taking care of the resources that we have. And so somehow you incorporated that into tournament fishing. And I think I was listening to the Mercer show not too long ago, where he was talking about some of those tournament fishermen were actually upset that they were going to have to release those fish because that was kind of part of one of the perks of tournament fishing was you go out, you pay your entry fee, you had a chance of winning some money, but you also got to take that food home to the family. And there was a little bit of, change. Nobody likes change, whatever it is. So there's a little bit of headbutting going on when they went from probably 10 to 7 and then 7 catch and release. And then ultimately we've kind of settled in at 5, but it's just hard for me to imagine. I've seen pictures of these guys holding up, 5-6 pound fish, two stringers of fish. And they're going to, their eyes are all lifeless and they're going to the frying pan.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way.
And it's been an evolutionary process. I'm 68 years old, and I started tournament fishing when I was in junior high. And at that time, we had fish fries after every tournament. We kept them all, and we cut them open and cut them, filleted them, and we had fish fries for the club and the families and that sort of thing. In 1972 is when Ray Scott decided to try what back then they called it the don't kill your catch concept that has evolved into what we know now as catch and release. And the story goes that the first tournament they did that was on Ross Barnett in Mississippi, and the state agency told him, no, you can't release those fish. You have to keep them, because they were afraid that they were going to be diseased or they were all going to die. There was all kind of excuses, and Ray just put his foot down and said, no, we're turning them loose. And that sort of evolved over the course of the next year. Back then, boats didn't have live wells. Nobody really knew how to take care of these fish. It was all kind of a new thing, but Ray had the vision, the foresight to realize that bass are recyclable, that they can be caught more than once, just like his trout fishing buddies when he saw them, how they were taking care of trout, realizing that, hey, these fish can be caught again. We don't have to potentially hurt the resource that the sport depends on. And obviously, in his case, it was a fledgling business. And Ray and every owner of bass since then realizes at some level that, without clean water, without healthy fish populations, they don't have a business, because the business depends on that resource. And so the conservation side of things has always been a pretty important component of what B.A.S.S is. And obviously, working with state agencies, we kind of take our lead from a lot of them on what the rules need to be. The idea of more restrictive length limits or bag limits, like you were saying, going from 10 to 7 to 5, which is what most tournaments do now. That's kind of played along with, as the biology, as the science has advanced and evolved, managers know more about the fish populations and what it takes to take care of them. And so, the tournament rules and regulations have kind of just fallen right along in line as those sort of things have evolved. And as we learn more, we've made changes over the years. But Ray definitely was, pioneered that whole concept. And it, over the years, it has just sort of become ingrained in bass anglers that, the catch and release ethic is what everybody practices. And it's even spilled over into most other sport fish now. That, there's people that catch and release, whether it's crappie or catfish or, you name it. It's people don't harvest fish nearly as much as they used to. And I remember,
has that hurt the fisheries? The race stop mentality of don't kill your catch and release. We had a local biologist on a handful of months ago, and he talked about a lot of that evolution of our sport of tournament fishing, of catch and release, has hurt a lot of these fisheries just because it's stunted some of their growth, where you have an abundance of that shorter fish, because bass fishermen don't want to take and eat them. Catching with our bassing with Big Malone says it right here. You got to take some of them out to thin the herd, essentially. What are your thoughts on that?
It's very, very location specific. Every lake, every river is going to be a little different. But 40 years ago, the number of bass that were harvested was probably around 40% or something thereabouts. Of the bass that got caught, about 40% or so of them went home with somebody. Now, and I'm talking about like on a national average, now that number's like maybe 5%. So the harvest, the catch and release mentality has caught on so strongly that anglers don't keep fish like they need to in some cases. And there are some lakes, some reservoirs where harvest of the right sizes of fish would actually be beneficial. Typically, when you think about a slot length limit, lakes that have slot length limits, the goal there is to allow people to keep the smaller fish, because there's more of them, and thin them out so that there's more food to feed the rest of the fish, so they grow faster and get bigger. And you wind up with potentially more quality size fish. The problem with that is that nobody keeps the little ones. Very few of the ones you want to get rid of are those fish that are 10, 12, 13 inches long. And a lot of people just don't want to mess with keeping a bunch of little bass like that. And society has just kind of changed. And so people aren't fishing for food like they used to. So in some lakes, the level of harvest that we have is significantly lower than it needs to be. That's not every lake, though. There's some lakes where things are better balanced, and you know, excessive harvest would not be a good thing. And that's one of the challenges that biologists have around the country, whatever lakes they're managing, is it's hard to find a one size fits all regulation. And in a lot of cases, since anglers are not keeping fish like they used to, sometimes those length limits and bag limits really are pretty useless. You know, if you got a 14-inch length limit and a 5-fish bag limit, but nobody's keeping bass, then what difference does it make?
Yeah.
So what some states are starting to do now, Florida started this several years ago. Oklahoma just put it into practice this about 2 years ago. They're now saying, okay, our limit used to be in Oklahoma, it used to be 14 inches, 6 fish per day. Now you can only keep one bass over 16 inches, but you can still keep 6 of them under. So what they're trying to do is encourage people to turn the bigger fish loose and keep the little ones. I don't know if it's going to work. This whole catch and release mentality is so strong with people. You know, it took many years for that to kind of, for the catch and release thing to really catch on, so to speak. And it's going to take quite a long time for it to go back the other way, to encourage people to harvest more bass.
I agree. We have 2 local lakes here, very small lakes in comparison to the national scene. You know, one of them's around 1,100, 1,200 acres. The other one's 1,800 acres. One of them is a very, very deep, very, very clear reservoir. It has 2 different classes of largemouth in them. They're 4 to 12 pounds. They're giants, or they're
less than 12 inches.
Yeah, they're small fish.
Yeah.
Talking to the state biologist, he says, same thing we just discussed, take the little ones out of that lake.
Right.
There is no length limit on that lake. And I don't know if there's a creel limit on that lake, because they encourage you to remove as many as you can of that stunted class.
Right.
And then the little bit larger lake has the protected slot. 14 to 18 inches is protected. 1 fish over 18 inches. And I think it's 5 fish, 4 or 5 under. That's our home tournament lake that we fish a lot of our tournaments at. And honestly, for Southern Illinois, pretty healthy fishery. If it was a 5-fish tournament without any restrictions, you would probably see anywhere during the right time of the year, you'd see anywhere from 22 to 27, 28 pounds winning. So it's a super healthy fishery. The slot has worked, but it goes back to the same deal that there is a plethora of those undersized fish. Now, obviously, like you said, this is for all those that are listening throughout the country, this is a case-by-case scenario. Talk to your state and local fish biologist and understand what the makeup of that lake is. There's so many different variables. These 2 lakes are within 30 minutes of each other and are vastly different fisheries.
Right.
So it's not even just a local regional thing. It's a lake by lake deal.
And, you know, a lot of times, especially on lakes that have slot length limits, unless there's been some creel studies done to show how many fish are being actually removed, a lot of people make the assumption that creel or that slot limit is working, but it may be really that lake just has a natural balance in terms of predators and prey. If you still got a lot of little fish that are not growing very fast, it probably means there still needs to be more of them removed. And that's one of the things that, you know, that slot length limit is there to encourage the harvest of smaller fish. And it kind of goes back to the old in fisherman concept of selective harvest rather than strictly catch and release. You know, they started preaching the concept of selective harvest decades ago. And the whole idea was there's times when it's a good thing to keep bass, and there's other times when it's not. And, you know, I think what's happened over the years is that, you know, there's some lakes where, gosh, if you keep a bass, you get drawn and quartered. They just string you up. It's just, yeah, you post a picture on social media of somebody keeping a bass, and you just get absolutely grilled. And, you know, those limits are there to allow people to harvest fish. And there is a certain percentage of the angling public that still wants to keep fish and take them home. And what a lot of those regulations are trying to do is encourage them to do that on the smaller end of the spectrum, to the smaller fish, because that ultimately is usually better for the fishery.
Yeah, I hate the problems I have, and this is just me, is seeing people that are keeping the, you know, to be honest, like 3 pounds, anything above 3 pounds gets under my skin for whatever reason. I don't mind, kill all the 14, 15 inches, even the 16 inches, that's fine. But and I think a reason that it bothers me is because we have another lake in this area. It's like 100 and what is Gerardo, like 140 acres, something roughly, like that. It's a small lake, 140 acres. It's a fragile system. You can make a big difference in a lake by pulling, in my opinion, if you got a small lake, pulling large bass out of it can make a big difference in a short period of time. And I remember seeing a guy one day, he'd pulled up in his John boat, and he had 3 like 5-6 pound bass in a bucket, you know, just a bucket. And it broke my heart just to see that caliber of fish being removed out of that smaller body of water.
Right.
What about, like, 2 questions. Why the 14, 15 inch range? You always hear, you know, if it's a straight slot, it's usually 15 or maybe 16. If it's a slot, usually that lower end's like 14, and then there's an upper end that's a little bit bigger to encourage, you know, maybe trophy. So why those 2 numbers? And then how big of a role does it play taking those larger than average fish out of a body of water? Because I've heard that, you know, those are future spawners, and those genetics are being taken out of the system if those fish are removed. Is there any truth to that? And what's your thoughts on all that?
Okay. First part of the question, the size. Generally, the lower end of a length limit is set to allow those fish time to grow up to maturity and at least spawn once. And generally that's a 12 to 14 inch fish in most places. Like here in Oklahoma, it takes about 3 years to get a fish to 14 inches. And so just depending on where you are, north to south, you know, that number is going to vary. But 14, 15, you know, that range is kind of where the fish have matured. They've probably been, they're big enough to have already spawned at least once, maybe twice. So protecting them once they get bigger than that, it is really only necessary if there's not a surplus of them. Now, if you got a surplus of a certain size, for example, I know of about a 200 acre lake that has the fish are kind of stunted, but they're stunted at 16 to 18 inches. They don't hardly ever get any bigger. It's just the way nature set that place up, the balance as far as the food and that sort of thing. So if you had a 14 inch minimum length limit or something like that, you know, those fish could be harvested because they're all over that size. But nobody's keeping them, so it doesn't really matter that much. But the idea of the slot limit of the upper end usually is just, that's sort of a, well, what do fishermen, that if somebody wanted to keep a really nice quality size fish, how big would it need to be? If your goal is to produce, quote, trophy fish, then you just keep bumping that upper limit up 18, 20, 21 inches or something like that. And obviously those fish are starting to get older. And then you start taking the chance that, well, a bunch of them may die of old age before they ever get that big.
Yeah.
And if they're not growing fast enough, if you haven't thinned out the little ones enough, sometimes those fish won't grow out of that slot. And I kind of think this lake that I'm talking about, that's kind of what's happened, is that their growth slows down so much when they get up there to 16, 18 inches. There's just not enough food to push them on up there to get them into, to be 20 or 21 or 22 inch fish. So there's kind of a trade-off there, and that's where the biologists have to look at the growth rates and the amount of forage. And so there are a number of statistical or mathematical models that biologists can use, but they gotta plug in all kinds of variables to figure out, okay, what's going to be the best way to get the most out of this particular lake. Because like you said, every lake's going to be a little bit different in terms of the growth and the population dynamics of how that system is working. As far as taking those fish out, a 3, 4, 5 pound bass has already spawned several times.
Yeah, that's
so
true. Yeah,
they have already contributed to the gene pool in that lake. It's like let's say a 10 pound bass. If somebody catches a 10 pound bass and wants to keep it and have it mounted, I don't have a problem in the world with that. That fish has probably spawned several years. It's probably pretty old. In most places, it's going to be 10 or 12 years old, and bass don't live a whole lot longer than that. So that fish may not ever really contribute to the gene pool much, if it was released and for the rest of its life. Now, in some states, like in Texas or in Louisiana or Florida, those where they grow a little faster, a 10 pounder might not be as old, and it might have a chance to spawn a few more times. Obviously, Texas is taking those share lunker fish, the 13 pounders, and taking them back to the hatchery and spawning them. But for the most part, in natural systems, those fish are probably dying of old age fairly soon after that. Excuse me. So now a 5 pound fish or 4 pound fish, that's a different story. They do have the potential of spawning a few more times and growing to get even bigger.
Well, I know the 10 pounders aren't dying in my live well because I don't catch them.
No.
So they got to worry about me.
Well, and you bring up that point, like the biology of lakes is volatile, and it changes from area to area, state to state, lake to lake.
Right.
I think what most of us are probably more concerned with is fish care and how to take care of these fish and how to preserve our, a lot of us are tournament anglers. Some of us obviously aren't, but would like to probably some insight of like some of the biggest fish care issues that you see and what can anglers do better from that fish care standpoint.
We have a guideline on bassmaster.com. You just put in the search thing, you put in keeping bass alive, those 3 words, keeping bass alive, and it will take you to a little guidebook that pretty much explains what you need to know about fish care in terms of tournament situations. Dr. Hal Schramm, who used to be at Mississippi State University, he and I wrote that little booklet in 2003. And we stand by the same recommendations now that we did 20 years ago. It's been tested, it's been proven. There have been a number of studies that have shown that these techniques work to help, with survival of fish that are going through what I call the tournament experience. Getting caught, handled, put in a live well, hauled around, going through a weigh-in, and ultimately released again. And the concepts that we put into keeping bass alive are pretty straightforward. You've got to maintain water quality, oxygen levels, and temperature. And depending on the situation you're in and how much stress those fish are under, what the water temperature is especially is important. You anglers just need to be more conscientious and pay attention to the care of those fish. It's not so easy as just throw them in the live well, flip on the aerators, and forget about them for hours until the weigh-in. And it's more and more critical as the water temperature goes up, because there's a direct relationship with water temperature and post-release survival. And so those tips that are on keeping bass alive on the website are a little more specific towards tournament anglers and what they need to do in terms of taking care of fish in their live well. The tournament director, people that are running the show, they can only do so much in terms of first aid, if you want to call it that, at the weigh-in. The angler's got the fish in his live well for 4, 5, 6, 8 hours. And so they're the ones that really have to pay attention to taking care of those fish. Because the whole problem that we've tried to talk about for all these years is delayed mortality. The fish may come to the weigh-in alive, but they may die several days later, and the anglers don't understand that because they don't see it. The fish swim away. They look fine. And 2 or 3 days later, they may die. So following the procedures that we've recommended for all these years, you can reduce that delayed mortality to where it's pretty much insignificant in terms of how it affects the fish population. And that's really the bigger issue here, is from a biological standpoint, the number of fish that die because of bass tournaments is really not impacting the overall numbers of bass in the lake. Yes, some of those fish die. And hopefully at the end of the day, the tournament organizations are conservative. They keep fish back that might be weak or struggling, and they donate them. They have a fish fry. They do something with them. They don't waste them. But in terms of impacting the overall bass population, the tournament fishing has not been found to have a big impact on the overall bass population. And so, and that's where, we kind of take our cues from the state fish and wildlife agencies. If they say, well, everybody can keep 5 fish, Well, technically, in a bass tournament, then if every angler wanted to, they, according to the rules, could keep their 5 fish. And the state biologists are saying that would not be harmful to that fish population. We don't do that. Tournaments try to turn them all loose. And even if 10, 20, 30% of the fish in tournaments that are weighed in don't survive, that means 70 or 80 or 90% of those fish do survive. 40 years ago, we kept them all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, the criticisms that tournaments get for harming lakes, I think is a lot of it's very unjust, because the tournament organizations are the ones that really helped instill this catch and release ethic in a lot of anglers. And, you know, tournament anglers do whatever they can. They don't want to see fish die. They want them to survive. They want to be able to catch them again. So it's there's a lot of ethical issues and social issues, really more so than biological issues in terms of management of those fish populations. So it's kind of a juggling act, but you know, those pretty simple concepts that we put out in the Keeping Bass Alive booklet. And by the way, I'm very hopeful that over the next several months we're going to be able to get a lot of that information put together in video format, because we're finding that so many of the high school and college anglers, they don't go to websites and they're not going to read the stuff that we have. But if we can get it put into a YouTube video,
yeah,
we have a much better chance of getting that information out there where they can use it. And especially like with the high schools, so many of the high school kids are fishing with a parent or an adult who's the boat captain. And in a lot of cases, those boat captains may not be avid tournament anglers and may just not know what they need to do to keep fish healthy. So, you know, that's part of what we want to try to do, is put together a lot more educational information to help with that side of it.
Yeah, I think one of the most disheartening things that you see is this happened not too long ago in a BFL at Kentucky Lake, but day after the tournament, you go to the marina and there's, you know, like 40 keeper-sized bass floating around dead. Typically, I've heard about it around here in some of these smaller lakes that have tournaments, especially in the summer. Well, mainly in the summer. It usually only happens in the summer. And it just leaves a bad taste in people's mouth when they show up the next morning after tournament and there's all these nice fish floating around.
So I understand that at the end of the day, like that's terrible for a fishery, but like my combat to that, not that it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we see it because it's all concentrated in one area. What is the overall impact to that fishery? If 40 fish died today, how many fish died of natural causes today in that?
But lake? I think it's because the people didn't actually harvest the fish.
Right.
It's all around waste. That fish is just wasted.
Exactly. It's an optics thing. It's a social issue that it looks bad. And bass tournaments get a bad rap when those sort of things happen. And that's why we have preached for 20 years to try to get anglers to do a better job of taking care of their fish, and tournament directors to do whatever they can on the weigh-in side to make sure that they run a good weigh-in, so that you don't have a lot of dead fish floating around at the end of the day or 2 or 3 or 4 days later. Because, I mean, face it, bass tournament anglers make up a very, very, very small percentage of the total number of anglers out there. We kind of get tunnel vision just because that's the world we live in. But tournament anglers probably only make up about 10%, maybe 15% of the total number of people that fish for bass.
Mm-hmm.
And And so it's a pretty small minority. And I think what we used to always try to impress on the tournament organizations and the anglers was, if you do a better job of policing yourself, doing a better job of taking care of your fish, you don't have to worry about somebody coming along and making you do it by forcing regulations and restrictions on you that you probably don't want. And so it's better to educate than it is to regulate, we always used to say. And so, that's what we really want to try to get across to tournament anglers in particular, is, they can do a better job and be a little more conscientious. And you mentioned the summertime issue. That's certainly every study that's been done on bass mortality shows there's a direct correlation between water temperature and survival of those fish. And the hotter the water, the poorer the survival. And so there's a lot of things you can do to help offset that. More using ice in your live wells in a modest amount. You can help with oxygenation, and there's all sorts of things that you look through our procedures that you can do. But the easier thing is to say, how about we just don't fish tournaments in July and August?
Amen.
Or if we're going to have tournaments in July and August, maybe we make them shorter hours so we don't have fish in the live well so long. Maybe we go to a 3 fish limit instead of 5.
Yeah.
There's some things like that still allow people to have those competitions, but they're not going to take quite the toll on the resource, and it will help avoid some of those negative situations like you're talking about with a bunch of bass floating up around the marinas and the boat ramps and places where the people that are already not happy with tournaments, that it just you take ammunition away from them, because there seems like there's always going to be people out there that are wanting to try to shut tournaments down for one reason or another. And dead fish is just one more reason that gives them ammunition.
Yeah, I think one thing I see that people really need to be mindful of is the amount of oxygen that is in a weigh-in bag as far as the water, the oxygen to water ratio inside of a weigh-in bag that's got 5 fish in it. You've got these 5, 2.5 to 4 pound fish in a weigh-in bag, and you just got enough water to cover their backs for the most part. And you really see this in club tournaments and a lot of the smaller jackpot tournaments.
Right.
Where there's guys standing in line for 3-4 minutes, maybe, just standing there waiting for their turn to dump those fish. And they're sitting, and the oxygen's got to be depleted out of the water by the time they dump them. And it's 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Well, I see that. That's a problem then, because I see people having fish a lot longer than that.
And they've got those fish in a bag, and they're sitting there holding it on the hot asphalt.
Yes, exactly.
So there's stupid stuff like that that's so easy to fix. And that's one of the things that we really try to get across to some of these organizations and the anglers, is that those are easy fixes. And the way you do that is you don't hand out so many bags. You have fewer bags so that when somebody bags their fish up out of their live well, they come straight to the scales, and they're not waiting in a line. Or
make the angler wait in line for the bag, not the fish.
Yeah, and then you have to use the organization's bag too, because in a lot of jackpots, everybody has their own bag, so they just
exactly. Or you have tanks, where they can come up and they can put their fish in a waiting line tank. Which even a small club, my little club here in Oklahoma City, we've got one tank, That's all. But we only have 10 boats in our tournaments. So it's enough, and we regulate the number of bags that are handed out. So, we don't have more than 3 or 4 guys waiting in that tank at any one time before they're weighing their fish. And so one of the things that I really hope that we can get done over the next year is, the Bassmaster weigh-in system that we have perfected over the years. Obviously, it's set up for large tournaments. Whether we have a 250 boat open or a 100 boat elite tournament or a high school tournament, we use the exact same procedures at all of those tournaments. The same number of tanks, the same everything. The only difference is at the elite tournaments we have the big stage, but everything else backstage, the whole fish care system is the same. That system can be shrunk down to make it work for a local club tournament. You don't need 12 tanks. You don't have to have a release boat. You don't have to have all the components that we necessarily do for an elite tournament. But there's parts and pieces of that process that you could use I've always called it a fish friendly weigh-in, so that you do at least the weigh-in side of the equation can be better for the fish. It's kind of a first aid station. It's kind of intensive care, so to speak. Those fish have been in a live well for who knows how many hours, and the goal of the weigh-in process ought to be get them through there as quickly as possible, treat them as well as possible, make sure they're safe to release, and get them back in the lake as quickly as you can. And it's not rocket science, and I think it's something that we hope that more and more clubs and groups realize that there's little things they can do that can really make a pretty big difference.
So as an angler, besides obviously the ice, recirculation pumps, aerators, what is anything that you would recommend adding to a Livewell system beyond that to keep our fish healthy while we're toting them around for 8 hours out of the day?
Yeah. Well, I think the best Livewell systems have multiple pumps. I say most modern bass boats have like 2 separate live wells. Some of them have one big live well with like a divider in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
But you're being able to move a lot of water is a good thing. And so having either multiple pumps or bigger pumps that can pump in a lot of fresh water or recirculate a lot of water, and as they're recirculating, helping to incorporate fresh air into the system is always a big bonus. One thing that we get a lot of questions about are some of the oxygen systems. The little round oxygenator discs that mount on the side of the live well. Those are a good supplement, but they're not enough by themselves to keep fish healthy. You still have to have a good aeration system. Under extreme conditions, hot conditions with big loads of big bass, a lot of times some of the boats, especially if they're a little bit older, have a hard time keeping up in terms of keeping the water oxygenated well enough, because the fish are using oxygen faster than the aeration system can put it back. And in those kind of situations, that's where some sort of a supplemental oxygen system might be in order. One of my colleagues at Texas Parks and Wildlife put together a system. In fact, it's on the Parks and Wildlife's website that talks about using bottled oxygen. He's fishing Sam Rayburn in the heat of the summer where they're catching, 25, 30-pound bags. And it might even be a team or a draw tournament where you've got a angler and a co-angler. So you might have 50 pounds of fish in that live well.
Yeah.
And you almost have to have some sort of oxygen system, whether it's a commercially bought system or a do-it-yourself one that you make from, components that you can buy off the shelf to help keep something like, those kind of fish alive. We've seen a little bit more of that interest in that sort of thing in smallmouth tournaments up in the northern states, because smallmouth are much more sensitive to low oxygen and to temperature variation. And so you've got to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more conscientious when you're dealing with smallmouth and making sure that your aerators are running full tilt and you keep your temperatures moderated, because they're a different animal, and it's a little tougher to make sure that they're staying healthy. So, and that's one of the things on our new version of the Keeping Bass Alive. We actually make a couple of changes to incorporate some slightly different recommendations if you're dealing with smallmouth rather than largemouth. And it's mostly related to water temperature and oxygen levels. So, but the most modern bass boats have pretty decent aeration systems, the pumps and I've always been a fan of having redundant systems. If one set of pumps goes out, I can turn another set on, and in boats that have dual live wells, being sure that you use both sides. Don't try to cram all the fish into one side. But again, oxygen and temperature, and temperature is a real easy one, because you can buy a $5 floating swimming pool thermometer to keep in your live well and really keep track of what's going on in terms of the temperature in your live well. And we always recommend using ice anytime you're recirculating that water to try to knock the temperature down about 5 degrees, maybe 5 to 7. You don't want it too much because you don't want to shock them. But a little bit cooler really helps maintain those fish in a better environment. Cooler water holds a little more oxygen. And so now if you're pumping fresh water, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to put a lot of ice in there, because it just flushes it right out.
Right.
But anytime that you're
hot water in sometimes too, especially in the middle of the day, that surface temperature is warmed up, you're taking a little bit cooler water and you're replacing it with warmer water.
Right. So recirculating is when the water temperatures get over 75, 80 degrees, that's when we want to just start recirculating and putting ice in there and knocking the temperature down just a little bit.
So just to be clear, when you say recirculating, you're keeping that same water in that system. You're not replacing that with new fresh lake water.
Correct. Because what you were saying, a lot of times you may be pumping in hot surface water as you get later and later in the day. And so you don't want to do that. You want to try to maintain, whatever the water temperature was first thing in the morning. That's kind of your benchmark. Mm-hmm. And you want to shoot for 5 degrees or so below that is about where we want to hit that mark. And, by the middle of the day, your surface temperatures may come up 10 degrees, and you don't want to be pumping that water back in on top of your fish. So now if the water temperatures are down in the 50s or 60s, you just pump fresh water and just turn the pumps on, let them run, and keep a constant flow of fresh water through there. And generally you'll keep your temperature and your oxygen levels sufficient to keep your fish healthy. It's when it starts getting up there into the 70s and even higher in some cases, if you, some of the times here in the summer, we'll have 85, 90-degree surface temperatures.
Yep.
And you really got to stay on top of things when you got those kind of conditions. Now, one thing I just saw pop up there, somebody said something about hydrogen peroxide.
Yep.
Right.
So we do not recommend hydrogen peroxide for a couple of reasons. Yes, it will boost oxygen in your live well water for a very short period of time. But you think about what it does when you pour it on a cut on your finger. It actually eats up, it eats the tissue up a little bit. It does the same thing on the gills of fish. It's the most sensitive thing on a fish is their gills. If you get a little bit too much hydrogen peroxide, rather than splitting up into oxygen in the water, it starts to attack the gill tissues, and it can kill your fish. And there's a real fine line between enough and too much. And
bass fishermen are really good at measuring things out when they pour it in their live.
Yeah, more's better.
Yeah. Well, if a capful is good, a whole bottle must be better.
That's right. And it's cheap too. It's like 97 cents. Just pour the whole thing in there.
Yeah.
Goes in 5 pounds.
So it's 7. Actually, there's a somewhere on the internet there is a little study that Texas Parks and Wildlife did years ago where they looked at that and found what it was doing as far as boosting oxygen and how short of term it actually made a difference. And so we have decided that there's too many downsides to it. It's great for cleaning your live well and sterilizing and sanitizing your weigh-in bags and that sort of thing. But we don't recommend putting it in your live well when you got fish in there. Mm-hmm. So if a little's good, a lot can be deadly, and that's the problem with it is the benefits are just too unpredictable.
Is there anything that you recommend additive wise to put in your live wells? Somebody had mentioned the blue juice,
G juice.
There are 3 things that are approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for putting on fish that might be released and caught again by somebody and eaten. Are you following me there?
Yeah, I just think it's kind of hypocritical, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, if somebody treats fish in a live well and then at the end of the tournament they turn them loose, and the next day some kid catches that fish on a worm sitting on the shoreline and takes it home and eats it.
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay. The 3 things that are approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration are ice, salt, and oxygen. Period.
Huh.
The commercially available chemicals that are out there on the market all have ingredients in them that by themselves, each one of those individual ingredients may be approved for this or that. But when you mix them all together, you have a new compound. And if you soak fish in it, some of that is absorbed into the fish tissues. And none of those companies have done the testing to prove that those things are safe for human consumption. So B.A.S. and every other state agency won't recommend any of them. Doesn't mean they don't do some good things, but they haven't been proven to be safe, so we just can't recommend them.
So you don't want to put a shot of G juice in your Kool-Aid in the morning or your coffee.
I don't think I would.
What about like I coined it home remedies as I was writing some stuff down this evening for bleeding fish that were caught deep. Obviously, care is huge there, but you hear about folks pouring Mountain Dew down their throat, pouring something that's carbonated down their throat.
There's discussions whether it's the actual citric acid or whether it's the carbonation. Maybe a little bit of both. There was actually a study done in Canada a few years ago that they used northern pike as their test fish, but it's the same thing. They would cut a gill filament, and then they would pour all kinds of different things down the fish's throat and see what happened. And then they put them in some holding containers or ponds or something to see what happened to them. And they found that turning the fish loose and letting the cool water just naturally clot the blood was by far the best thing to do. And just like the commercial fish care products out there on the market, we don't know what happens to those fish 2 or 3 days later if you pour Mountain Dew down their throat, or Coca-Cola or something, that potentially even more acidic. What does it do to the gills? Yeah, they may survive till they get to weigh in, and they may swim off, but we don't know what happens to them later. And so that's why, there's a lot of these home remedies, you might call it, that people have come up with over the years. But we really just don't have a lot of good information on what happens to them down the road. And that's why we don't recommend any of those sort of things.
You mentioned salt. Do you recommend putting salt in your live well?
Yes. When you're recirculating.
Okay.
Obviously, if you're pumping fresh water all the time, it just flushes it right back out. Every fish farmer, every hatchery, when they're hauling fish, they put salt in the water because a fish's blood is just slightly saline, just like your blood is.
Okay.
And when you put a little bit of salt in the water, it makes the water just a little bit closer to what their blood is like. And so it helps them kind of relieve some of that stress. It helps them maintain their internal salt balance a little better. And so when you're recirculating your water in your live well, we recommend using non-iodized salt. I mean, you can buy it at the grocery store. You just want the kind that does not have iodine in it. And it's a cup to 15 gallons of water.
Okay.
You can measure it out put it in a Ziploc bag and have it ready to go. As soon as you've got your live well filled up, you need to figure out how many gallons of water your live well holds, and don't rely on what the manufacturer tells you. Get yourself a 5-gallon bucket and actually measure the real volume of your live well.
Right. So
and then figure out
15 gallons.
How much a cup to 15 gallons.
That's
now.
In my mind, that seems like a lot of salt.
Well, yeah, and what you're doing is you're making I think it's about a third of 1% solution. I mean, it's not like seawater salty. We're nowhere near anything like that.
Right.
But it's just enough salty that it more mimics the fish blood, and that really helps them start to get over some of the stress. And so it's something that, like I say, hatcheries and fish farmers have used for decades. And when we set up our waiting line tanks at our Bassmaster events, we put salt in the tanks backstage. We put salt in our release boats, in the tanks on the release boats. It's just a routine practice anytime you're trying to hold fish in confinement. And I think it's especially important if you're going to keep them for any long length of time. If they're in your live well for an hour, might not be as big a deal. Now, if they're going to be, if you're going to have to recirculate that water for 3 or 4 hours, then yeah, it's definitely worth the effort. And you can tell when the fish come out of your live well, when you've been using ice and salt, their color is generally going to be better. They'll be slimy, which is a good thing, because that slime coat is their first line of defense against infections and stuff like that. So you can tell that it's doing good things for them, and it's easy and it's cheap.
So my biggest, this is one thing that I always like am concerned with. I always freeze water bottles and slowly put them in my live well instead of buying a bag of ice and just throwing it in the bottom of the live well. Is there a problem with just throwing non-lake water essentially in frozen non-lake water?
No. Okay. I
think chlorine was always a concern.
Yeah,
some people say there might be
chlorine. In fact, that one of the things that that Todd Driscoll at Texas did with he was doing that oxygen study is they looked at the amount of chlorine in commercial bagged ice, and it's like almost none.
Okay.
It's we use bagged ice at our tournaments, because what we're trying to do is, we pump the water out of the lake into the holding tanks, and we want to knock that temperature down really quickly so that it's ready to go when the anglers bring their fish up. So bagged ice or crushed ice will knock the temperature down very quickly, but block ice or something frozen in milk jugs or bottles or whatever, like you were talking about, in the long run is probably a little better because it helps maintain the temperature over a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas crushed ice will knock that temperature down really quick, but it tends to spike, and then you kind of have that yo-yo effect. Whereas if you've got a block of ice, it melts slower, and it gives you a more kind of a even temperature over the course of, like in my boat, I've got an old, it's a 1996 Champion. It's got about a 30-gallon live well, and I can put an 8-pound block of ice, which is the equivalent of 1 gallon of, in like a gallon jug frozen, and it'll keep my live well about 7 degrees cooler for 3 hours. And then I know it's time to put some more ice in there. It's when I got my little pool thermometer, and when it starts to creep up, I know it's time to take that block out and put me a new one in, so that I want to try to maintain a fairly even temperature over the course of the day.
I'm buying a pool thermometer.
I mean, the thing you got to remember too is you got to have a place to carry that extra ice. And like I say earlier, with smallmouth especially, it's that's a big deal. And so you got to
you put it in your co-angler's lap, and he just has to do it.
Plan ahead. Yeah.
Hey, real quick, we got Ron DeRosa's on here. His uncle Jim DeRosa has been highly involved in the Smallmouth Alliance for years up there at Mille Lacs. So he chimed in. He said Gene was very, very helpful in interpretation of the data we collected on our population study at Mille Lacs, and that we did with the MDNR. So shout out from Ron for all the hard work you've done in the past up there.
Thanks. I keep threatening to get back up there and go fishing with Jim sometime. I've got a buddy that lives in the summertime who lives in Minnesota, and I go up there and try to spend a week with him, and we get down to Mille Lacs pretty regularly.
Oh, I'm
kind of a smallmouth junkie.
Dude, I had the pleasure to go up there with Ron and fish. I think we fished like 5 days because Ron was guiding up there for several years. He hasn't for the last couple of years, but he invited me up there. So I made that 12-hour drive, and it was one of the best drives I've ever made in my life. It was unbelievable. Yeah. Just those smallmouth fisheries up there, there's nothing like them. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I've told my wife any number of times that I would really like to have a place in Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin, somewhere up there, around smallmouth country, and then maybe in the wintertime, I'd have a place in Venice, Louisiana, and we could fish for redfish.
There you go.
And I would just migrate back and forth.
I got a good
smallmouth redfish.
Got back from Venice, and so mind you, we are all like John boat anglers down here, 16-foot with 10 horse outboards. We have a lot of horsepower restricted lakes in our area.
Right.
They all drug their John boats down to Venice, which is 8-9 hours, and just put in, I guess, in the backwater areas. And from the pictures that I saw, I haven't got to talk to them yet, but it looks like they had an absolute ball catching redfish.
Yeah.
All self-guided, no guides, just go down there and put it all together for a week. So
I've always said that if a redfish would jump, they would be the perfect fish. If smallmouth got as big as redfish, then they would be the perfect fish. So, but I love fishing for both of them.
Hey, one announcement here, and then I want to go down a little rabbit hole here.
Do we have to go down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, we got to, of course. Okay. So we are going to be doing a giveaway here in just a little bit. And the way we do our giveaway, there's several people on here, and we actually haven't did it this way in quite a while. We're going to make a reference to Sasquatch, and Gene gave me a number between 0 and 200. So whoever guesses that number.
You mean I got to go through this mess again?
Yeah, we're going to do. We haven't did this in a while.
I know.
Whoever guesses that number is going to win $25 gift card from Baitworks. The question I've been dying to ask, and this is, forward-facing sonar is super polarizing right now. It's, I mean, you can't go anywhere without anybody talking about it, and
you can't have a podcast without talking about it.
You can't have a podcast.
Hold on.
It's been scrolling in the questions.
Hold on. We went an hour and 17 minutes without mentioning it.
It's pretty good.
That's pretty good on a podcast.
Yeah.
There you go.
But what are your thoughts on how it affects a fishery? Because we've had numerous conversations, as has everybody else in the world, about this topic, and people hate it, people like it, people are in the middle, but it's such a unique time in tournament fishing with this stuff.
It is. It's easily, in fact, Panger and I were talking about this today, that it's easily the most polarizing issue that I can ever remember in 50 years of fishing. And one of the things that we do, we being Bass, we have a meeting every other year at the Bassmaster Classic. We call it our Conservation Summit. And we invite fisheries people from all of the states, and we invite our conservation directors from the various Bass Nation chapters around the country. And we talk about issues. And one of our topics this year was technology and where it's going. And we had a couple of presentations from a couple of the states that have looked into the forward-facing sonar phenomenon and how it's affecting anglers in their state. Now, I will say that it's very new in terms of what science has been thrown at it. There have been 3 studies done that I'm aware of where states looked at, while they were doing creel surveys and interviewing anglers on the water in various lakes, asking them if they use the technology or not. And then they ask about how many fish you caught and how many fish you kept, how big the fish were, all those kind of typical creel survey questions. And the upshot of it is that in most cases, people with the technology are catching more fish, but they're not keeping more fish. And in some cases, the numbers of anglers who already have the technology, now I'm not talking about just tournament fishermen, I'm talking about just people that are out fishing, is surprisingly high. The study in Texas found that among bass anglers, not tournament anglers, but just anybody that said they were bass fishing, it was like 47% of them already had forward-facing sonar. So it's a really high percentage.
When was this? What year is this?
This is like the last 2 years.
Okay.
And crappie fishermen, it's even higher because it really has caught on in the crappie world. In terms of the impacts on fisheries, that is still a very much an unanswered question because it is so new and it's not as pervasive a technology as some things that have been around a lot longer. So a lot of the states have not had a chance to really start to study what's happening in terms of effects on fish populations. In fact, next Monday, I'm going to be on a call. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is putting together a webinar next week where they've invited the fisheries chiefs from all of the states to get on a mass Zoom meeting to talk about technology and who's doing what, and what are the states doing to look into this to see what kind of threats there might be from it. In conversations that I've had with biologists from all over the country, the concerns tend to be more about species that are harvested more regularly, like crappie, like panfish, bluegill, yellow perch, possibly walleye, and especially in really small bodies of water, where the impacts could be seen more quickly. On the bass fishing side, like I said early on in our discussion, the percentage of bass that are being kept is so small these days that the impact of forward-facing sonar on bass populations, I haven't talked to anybody that is concerned at all with that, because the harvest of bass is so low. People might catch more fish, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be keeping any more fish. So, like I say, there's specific instances. I know that some of the states in the northern states where the ice fishing is a really big deal, they're kind of looking at it there because of the potential that, when fish get really concentrated in the wintertime in very small areas, they may become more vulnerable to people that are trying to harvest those fish. But on the bass fishing side, I couldn't tell you anybody that is seriously concerned about impacts to bass populations.
I know Stephanie, she's very anti-forward-facing sonar, and she said we'll find out that there isn't any big fish any longer, hence anglers out of work. Here's one thing I've learned with forward-facing sonar. We both have it on our boats, and we use it. The fish have gotten a lot smarter, so I don't think the mortality rates are going up. And like you said, it's catch and release with bass. I could see how it really may affect the crappie population in certain bodies of water. But as far as bass, I don't think people are taking more bass, but I do know for a fact that they are educating them, and it's making them harder to catch. And people that don't, I would almost like to do a poll, not tonight, but sometime in the future, the people that don't use that technology, are they finding it harder to catch fish? Because I think I notice it. There's a school of fish that I periodically just mess with, throughout they're in the general area from like late May to July, well, to the end of June or so, and then they kind of start busting up, and they get hammered a lot. They're thrown out. They're in an obvious location. I've noticed that those fish, even throwing a finessey type of presentation, they're like, as of a week ago, they're swimming away from the baits now. They've been hammered. They're exposed, and they're a lot harder to catch than they were a month ago. And it's because a lot of people have this technology, and a lot of people are targeting those individual fish. So they're getting educated. And when they are caught, they're being thrown back in the lake, and they're smarter. Each time they're caught, they're smarter and smarter, and they're passing.
I definitely think there's the potential for changing fish behavior.
Yes.
But at least in my opinion, at this point, there's not any strong evidence that we're affecting fish populations. Now, the idea that there's not going to be any more big fish, that's making an assumption that people are harvesting those big fish. I hear all the time that, these fish are out there roaming around, and we're fishing for fish that we've never fished for before. I hear that all the time. Well, those fish are up on the bank spawning at some point, and everybody's fishing for them then.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like those fish are completely immune to anglers. But I think the increases that we've seen in tournament fishing and in just fishing pressure in general, with or without the technology, is changing fish behavior. And I think there's a couple of studies going on where they put some radio transmitters and tag fish, and they're trying to kind of follow them around and looking at what happens to them when a boat simply gets nearby, whether it's got forward-facing sonar or not, and how those fish react just simply to the fact that there's a boat there. And they know it. Those fish know where, you think about how sound travels underwater. They're certainly aware of the boats and the traffic, and getting closer and closer to them. The thing we don't really know is now that we can see those fish, so to speak, on forward-facing sonar, we make some assumptions that they're doing something different than they did before we could see them.
For the last 1,000 years?
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
Maybe they've been doing this same kind of behavior for a long time. We just couldn't see them, so we didn't know about it. I remember reading decades ago that the hardest fish to catch are those suspended fish that live out in the middle of the lake.
Right.
Well, somebody knew they were out there. We just couldn't ever find them or catch them. Well, now we've got a way to figure out, they really do live out there. And now we've got a way of targeting those fish. Will that ultimately have impacts on the numbers or sizes of fish, bass I'm talking about, in our lakes? I just don't see how that's going to happen, unless something drastic changes in terms of the amount of harvest that we see among bass anglers. And I don't see that happening anytime in the near future.
I'll say two things on this. Like there's a lot of chatter in the chat about studies. You guys want to start funding the studies, then we can do more studies, but those studies aren't cheap to fund. Most state, I know I listened to you, I believe it was on Zaldane's podcast. You were talking about a $200,000 grant. $200,000 doesn't go very far.
Not more. No.
Not 2 million, not 20 million, 200,000 for an entire state to fund a program and have to allocate that money between different fisheries, different bass clubs. So studies are great in theory, but until somebody's going to be a $50 million donor to an organization that is going to start funding all these studies, it's hard to say that. What fishery biologists don't do, they don't care about how hard the fish is to catch. They care about how healthy the fish population is. That's our challenge as fishermen. Because
yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, I don't know any biologist that wants to make fishing worse. You know, part of their job is the customers that they serve are the people that are buying fishing licenses, and so part of their job is to actually try to serve the public, so to speak. It's just this technology hasn't been around that long, and it's just now really starting to become a big issue. I'm really anxious to find out when we have that call on Monday with a lot of these other states and the state fish and wildlife agencies to just see kind of across the board what the feeling is and what the plans are. You know, what are these other states around thinking that they're going to be? What do they need to look at, and do they have the resources? Do they have the money and the time? Is it high enough on their priority list with all the other stuff they've got to do to really start to look into this? And a lot of this was driven by the American Sport Fishing Association, the trade association for the fishing tackle industry. They have really encouraged the states to get ahead of this and let's figure out what's going on, because obviously from the tackle industry side of it, you know, people want to sell boats and rods and reels and tackle boxes and lures and everything else, and you got to have healthy fisheries to be in a position to where people are going to want to buy fishing tackle. And so they have really been encouraging the states to get on top of this and figure out, okay, what's going on. And I'm really anxious to see next week when we get on this call to see what comes out of that.
Are you going to post any of that? Will there be any documentation of that in the future?
I'm just a fly on the wall in that meeting. It's you know, I've been invited to sit in on it, and actually I've got two of them. I've got one in New Hampshire that I'm gonna. The northeastern states are having their own little meeting to talk about it. So I don't know exactly what kind of public information will come out of this thing. I think it'll kind of be up to each of the individual states to decide, you know, what they want to release to the public about their plans for investigating this. You know, I think in the crappie and the bass fishing world, maybe the muskie fishing world, it's a big deal. I'm not sure that the rest of the fishing world cares that much about it. Maybe from what I understand, if you're a marlin angler or sailfish, it's a big deal in saltwater, because they have $200,000 units that can see a marlin a mile away.
They've integrated AI into that, I believe. They can drop a waypoint on a marlin, and the boat will just follow that marlin
just
around.
Follow it.
Yeah, just follow it. Yeah.
So it's extreme. The tech, you know, and gosh, I mean, even you think about whether it's Active Target or Mega Live or LiveScope now, what's it going to be like in 5 years?
Yeah.
You know, technology is not going to quit advancing, and you know, I don't know. It's a very interesting time, and I think from any number of aspects. But personally, I don't, you know, on the bass fishing side, I just don't see that it's as much of a threat to our fisheries as some people seem to think it is.
Well,
Yeah,
you know, you go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I enjoy catching fish a lot. So here's how my outings on the lake have been. I'm a traditional power fisherman. Well, power fisherman, but I do like to finesse fish with smaller, like shaky heads and things like that. But I'll spend I would say majority of my time on the water doing that kind of stuff. I mean, I'll always have my forward facing sonar on, and I'm typically, if I find a stump or a brush pile, I'm casting my jig into it or a crankbait over the top of it or something. But most of the time I'm fishing, you know, visible cover, grass lines, things like that. But I usually budget in a little bit of time sometime during the day to go out there and cast at fish with a little minnow. I just think it's fun. It's kind of like my reward where I put in a lot of hard hours trying to put a pattern together traditionally, but then it's also fun to just go out there and just practice my casting and watch it all go down. But I mentioned the school of fish that I've been targeting for years that have gotten smarter and smarter. There's probably like 3 or 4 schools of fish that show up in certain locations every year. And I've caught those fish in the past long before forward facing sonar, 6, 7 years without forward facing sonar. The difference is you had to make a lot more cast. You had to count down the bait a lot more. You had to think just a little bit about more about where, you know, fan casting, and there's a lot more going on. But you can still catch those fish without that technology. What it boils down to, and I'm talking to a lot of these people that are hating on forward-facing sonar, it boils down to fish location. You got to be good enough to know where the fish are at, and I think that's what separates the weekend warrior from a Bassmaster Pro or any major tournament circuit pro is they know how to find fish. They know how to find fish faster than 90% of other people out there in this world. And they know how to make adjustments and bait selections. And that their job is to find fish and put fish in the boat. So there's this misconception that the only reason these guys are successful is because they've got this cheater technology on the front of their boat. Now, I do believe that there are some up and coming folks that lean on it very, very heavily, and they may be at a slight disadvantage if that forward-facing technology was eliminated from the tournament circuits. But I think majority of your pros are going to be able to catch fish just as good without that. You may see the upper limit of the bags. I mean, you may not see 130 pounds on Lake Fork without it. There's going to be some high-end bags, tournament winning weights that you won't see, but those guys know how to catch fish. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, where I've targeted these schools of fish on these certain locations for years. Those fish have always been there. If you're able to find those places, you can catch those fish with or without them, but looking at them, it's quicker. You know, it eliminates water a little bit faster because you can actually see real time what's going on. But you got to know where to go to catch fish. That's just bottom line.
At the end of the day, like you said it earlier, like this is one of the most polarizing topics,
right,
in recent, even distant history. But to that point, like I know exactly the 4 spots that you're talking about on the lake. And in 2007, when I got my first side scan, I discovered new areas on that lake. And that was way before a lot of folks had that technology because it wasn't readily available. It was very, very pricey at the time. I saved my money and I put it on my boat so I could catch those fish that I've only heard and, you know, dreamed about catching. And I started catching those fish. Well, fast forward 5 years later, more people have side scan. Those fish became more and more difficult to catch. Fast forward another 5 years, they're dang near impossible to catch after the first week they've moved out there because everybody now sees them. Now we have a new technology that I can pinpoint them and I don't miss. I make a perfect cast every single time. They get more and more pressure. Forward-facing sonar doesn't make it easier to catch. It just makes the fish more pressured on target.
Well, it makes you it makes you more.
You don't miss.
Right. You're what's the word I'm looking for? You're more
efficient.
You're more efficient. Thank you,
There you
Gene.
go.
You're a lot more efficient. You're not fan casting randomly as much, but it is definitely getting tougher. And you're seeing that in Bass. You're seeing like Koa Fujita. There are times when he just dominates, but there are times when he's had some pretty tough tournaments recently.
Right.
Just because you have it and you're the best at it. I mean, arguably he's one of the top 10 people in the world with it. I'm sure the people that fish against him would agree, but that does not mean that you're going to win a tournament. You could very well finish, 89th or 90th with that technology, even being the best at it. So there's times when you need to lean on it, and there's other times when you got to walk away. It's I really think it's a technique, in my opinion. I think it's a technique like a lot of other things. And I kind of when I'm in the zone and I'm skipping a jig down a bank in a live, in lay downs or around docks or whatever. Say I'm fishing a swim jig, I'm skipping it up underneath trees. You're making really accurate cast. You're not actually seeing the fish, but you're seeing all the little places where the fish could be. That, to me, that's how it is when I'm out there looking at the fish. I'm casting to those same type of places, but I'm actually seeing, the bait and go to the fish. I'm visualizing what's happened when I'm not actually looking at them. But in my opinion, it's a form of a technique, and it's fish are getting smarter is what I'm getting at. It was a long way to get around to fish are getting smarter.
Right. Agreed. Right. Everybody gives up their cell phone bait casters and outboard engines. I'll give up my forward-facing sonar.
Yeah.
You start paddling and fishing with a cane pole, then we can all have a good conversation.
Yeah. It's not going away.
It's not. It is definitely not going away.
No, like I said, what's going to come out next year, the next year, or the next year, and
it's going to be bigger, fatter, and faster. I promise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there have been any number of studies. Go back to that kind of a deal, where people have looked at what from a biology standpoint we call it catchability, and do fish have memory, and it's pretty obvious that when fish have a negative interaction, you might say, they remember those things a long time, like a year or more. And so if enough fish have those negative interactions with people, it changes their behavior. And who knows, maybe they communicate with each other somehow that we don't understand. It's like whales talking to each other. Maybe bass do the same thing. Who knows? We don't have any clue about that sort of thing. But potentially there's something going on there, that if enough of the fish have those negative interactions with when there's a boat nearby, and they start relating those things, then all of a sudden the next time a boat shows up, they automatically think, okay, I got to leave, and they're hightailing it to some other place where they feel safer. One of the radio tracking studies that they were doing on Toledo Bend was finding a lot of fish out in the middle of nowhere on big open flats with no cover, no brush piles, no nothing. And I got to thinking, well, have they always lived out there, or is that where they're living now because they have been pushed off of the preferred places where they used to live? And I always hear anglers talking about, I used to always catch fish on this brush pile or that brush pile, and they're just not there anymore. And even with the forward-facing sonar, they can look and see, yeah, those fish are just not there. They've moved somewhere else. we used to see that a lot with, you know, like when the Asian carp really started to get thick in Kentucky Lake, they took over a lot of places that the bass had been living. The bass were still there. They just got displaced. They got bullied out of those preferred locations. We used to see that here in Oklahoma. We started stocking sawguy, you know, the sauger walleye hybrid.
Yeah.
And the bass fishermen started telling us, hey, we ain't catching any bass anymore on my hotspot. It's all I catch are sawguy now. And for whatever reason, the bass decided they didn't want to live there anymore.
Those things
And
are ugly.
and the sawguy pretty much displaced them. And you know, so there's stuff like that that goes on that may have been going on for a long time, but now we can see it happening real time. And before, you know, before forward facing sonar, before live sonar of some sort, we just had to guess at what was going on down there.
Here's a great point. Mainstream fishing. What's up, Jermaine? Also a big thing. We aren't giving the fish the credit they deserve. They've been around for a while. They know how to adapt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a lot of truth in that.
They will. Yeah, it's and so it's going to be a constant race. You know, the fish will change, the fish will adapt, and some new technology will come along, and then they'll have to do it all over again.
Yeah, I've been turning
and somewhere the fishermen have to adapt. You know, they got to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now? You know,
yeah, I think
well, at the end of the day, we're talking about a very, very, very small population of fishermen. That this is all so polarizing over. How many fishermen are there in the United States? And how many
55 million.
And how many professional fishermen are we talking about?
Maybe 300.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. There's 300 guys that do this for a living, and there's, what'd you say, how many million?
55 million.
55 million people that fish in the United States. I would imagine that most of those people could give two craps less.
Well, the majority of people fish off the bank.
Yeah,
you know,
they don't have any clue or care about forward facing.
I would say. I mean, I'm just guessing, but I know that's me growing up forever. You know, I didn't have a boat. I fished off the bank.
I don't know how it breaks down with, you know, boat versus non-boat. I think there's a lot more boat fishing than what you might think, but it's still, you know, when it comes to certainly to professional anglers, they are a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. But this picture, this whole argument is really not just about whether or not the pro anglers can use the technology or not, or what kind of limitations should be in place or not. You know, I think from our standpoint at B.A.S., it's a very multifaceted question, because we have sponsors we have to worry about. We have fans that watch the product that we produce, whether it's the live stream or the television show. And you know, that's part of what B.A.S. does, is it produces content that hopefully people will watch. And so there's all those kind of questions. And so it goes beyond just, you know, whether or not the pro anglers are using it or not. It's that question becomes a much bigger issue, and there's a whole lot more moving parts to this thing than what a lot of people, you know, want to really think about. So hopefully, I think, you know, B.A.S. we have a technology committee that was set up the beginning of the year to investigate this. Our owners said we're not going to make a decision right away on what to do. We're going to study the situation and figure out what's best for the sport, best for the resource, best for the company. My role on that committee is to provide the biology, the science side of it, and the input that we get from state fish and wildlife agencies. And so, you know, that's I'm guessing that probably sometime this summer that the committee will make some recommendations to B.A.S.'s upper management about, you know, what our group as a group we think needs to happen, and then management will make some decision on which way B.A.S.S is going to go in terms of regulating the technology or not. And I at this point I don't have. I keep hearing people saying, "Well, what we're hearing is this is going to happen and that's going to happen."
Yeah, you hear the 48 inches of graph or 60 inches of graph and one transducer. That's a kind of
I think people are pulling that out of somewhere, but because our committee has not made any kind of statements, and B.A.S.S has not made any kind of policy statements about what's going on. We're still looking at it. We haven't discussed that sort of thing. We've got a call on that tomorrow to talk more about it.
Well, what did you say at the beginning of this conversation? B.A.S.S is a media company.
Yeah.
Not a fishing. Their media is fishing. It's it happens to be tournament fishing and education and putting out YouTube videos. That's where they make their money, through sponsorship dollars and all that. So
right.
Yeah, integrating. I think one of the from a educational perspective and from a fan viewer perspective, obviously, I'm just stating the obvious, but having the graph when somebody is fishing with LiveScope or forward-facing sonar, whether it be active target, whatever brand it is, but being able to have that graph, that visual come up on the screen and you can see what's going on. That's been a big help for me, because you hear people complain all the time. They get tired of looking at somebody's back while they're casting.
Yeah.
And there is some truth to that. But you know, I've went back and watched some older videos. Lynn Dollar always puts a lot of the old Bassmaster stuff up. Great channel if you haven't, if you want to go check out some of those old Bassmaster shows. But a lot of times the cameraman is in the back of the boat, and that's kind of what you're seeing.
Yeah, Tommy Biffle didn't say a lot of words back in the day.
You know, you are seeing that now. Obviously, that's not. Sometimes the guy's throwing out to the side, and you're seeing a top water, and you're seeing a spinner bait or a bladed jig or something. But a lot of the time, you are seeing the back of that angler. And one of the issues is there's a lot of live fishing. You're covering a whole tournament. You're covering however many hours of fishing, 4 days a week, 4 days of however many hours of fishing. That's a long time to watch somebody.
It's a whole different animal now. It's, you don't have it edited down into a 1 hour Bassmaster show that's on Sunday morning on TNN.
Right.
It's a kind of a saturation situation. And
well, that 1 hour told the 4 day story.
Right.
Not 1 day. That was 4 days of story.
Right. So it's the whole platform has changed, and so and that's all part of what other people within our company are having to wrestle with is, how do we blend all these things together and make produce a product that people want to watch, that sponsors want to support, that the anglers want to participate in. It's not an easy, one-sided kind of a decision that they have to make. And I'm, we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, that's all we can do. So being a biologist, you've been out in the field a lot of times. You ever run across any sign of Sasquatch or just rumblings from your fellow biologists? You ever hear of anybody having any kind of encounters or know of anybody that had any encounters? Because they are kind of popular down in Oklahoma and Texas area.
They are. There are. It's kind of, well, you know how a lot of communities sometimes kind of start little rivalries, and you'll drive through one little community and they'll say, you know, this is the home of Sasquatch. And then you drive down the road another 100 miles and there's another town that says, no, this is the home. And then you go up to the northeast part of the state and they'll say, well, no, we've been on TV. You know, the Sasquatch hunters have actually been here, so we must be the home.
Right.
All I can figure is that those critters get around. They must really travel a lot.
Well, they're a big animal. They require a big food source, so they do have
must be
a large home range to feed somebody that size. I mean, you're talking a 900,000 pound animal. You got to cover some ground.
That's it. Big feet with long legs.
That's why they have big feet and long legs, so they can cover more ground.
Yep.
So what we've got here is a bunch of numbers. This is Jonathan's favorite part of the stream, is everybody tries to guess the number.
I'm the one who's got to go through them all.
Is it closest or
no? It's dead on. Right, it's got to be dead on the money.
Oh. It's like those bass tournaments where you get an extra bonus if you catch a fish that weighs 4.29 pounds or something.
Right.
Yeah, we have one of those on Lake of the Ozarks. It's usually a 4.0 fish and it's a 3.0. It's $500 if you land on that.
Well, so weight. USA Bassin does like the Uncle Sam Bass Challenge. So they have like a collection that goes all throughout the year, and or I say all throughout the year until somebody hits it. And if you weigh your single fish weigh-in, if it hits that number and they draw that number for the month or whatever, you get that prize at the end of the month.
Oh, okay. That's fun.
So, but you never, I mean, it's just completely random. So,
yeah.
We've had a couple really, really, really close, but some of them that are really far off.
Hey, I got a question for you, Gene, while we're scrolling through these. I always wondered about when they release fish after a tournament. Let's just say they dump them right out in the marina there. I mean, I know sometimes they put them on the pontoon, they catch a release boat, and they dump them somewhere lake. But let's just say they're just dumping them in the marina.
Right.
How long do you think they stay in there? Do they stay in there? Do they migrate? I mean, I'm sure each fish has its own, personality and stuff. But what would you say? Give me some breakdowns maybe of what typically fish do when they're released in the marina.
The quick answer is it depends.
Okay.
Time of year makes a difference. In the cooler months, like in the winter or late fall, they don't move as much. In the spring and summer, they will migrate much faster. If there is plenty of food and habitat, then they don't necessarily need to go anywhere, unless they're just a crowding situation. We did a tagging study here years and years ago, and we found that about, trying to remember the numbers, this is back in the 90s, probably half the fish that were released we had a Wednesday night jackpot tournament at a local lake here, and they released the fish at the boat ramp every Wednesday night. And so we tagged a whole bunch of fish over the course of the year just to see where they went. And about half of those fish stayed within about a mile of that boat ramp for a year. Some of them, we had a couple of fish that went 7 or 8 miles away in 3 days. And other ones that swam up and down the shoreline for a matter of a couple of them 3 miles. But a lot of those fish stayed relatively close because everything that they needed to live, they found fairly close by. There was plenty of food. There was brush piles. There was habitat. There was weed beds. Whatever it was that they wanted. Now, some of the studies that have been done fairly recently, looking at fish with radio tags has found that after release, a lot of times they just go somewhere and they just sit for a while and recuperate. And so they don't go as far. But eventually, once they, you know, I'm just kind of putting it in my words, they kind of get to feeling better. They take off and they swim off. Now, in most cases, we don't know where they came from, so we don't know if they go home.
Yeah.
I think it's in a small lake. It's the you know, fish have been shown to have enough homing instinct, bass have, that in small lakes they can find their way back. But now you put them in a lake where they get hauled 30 miles away to a weigh-in and release, they don't know where home is, and the chances of them getting back home are probably pretty slim. But that doesn't give them a death sentence. That just means that they're going to have to set up shop somewhere new. And again, if they get out and find all of the things they need to survive, there's not as much reason for them to make any kind of big long migrations. Smallmouth tend to move a lot more. It's kind of something about, you know, they're kind of historically they're kind of a river type fish or a big lake fish, and so they're much more prone to making some pretty long movements after releases than, say, largemouth are. But you know, a lot of tournament guys know that, you know, some of the best places to fish are around release sites, because fish tend to, you know, those ABC fish, the already been caught fish,
and it's partially stocked too. You know, it keeps getting stocked all the time.
Right, and that's one of the things that we've tried to do for years with our live release boats. We're not trying to take those fish home, because we don't know where home is for them. What we're trying to do is move them away from some of those high traffic areas and places where they might be more vulnerable to being caught again and again and again, and potentially being harvested and taken home with somebody. So, you know, the whole concept of having a release boat or a trailer is really to just kind of help redistribute fish a little more around the lake into different parts of the lake, rather than turning them loose at the same place over and over and over.
We got a winner. So Aaron, yes, Aaron has won, but he wants to give his Baitworks gift card to Stephanie.
And she says
no. But Stephanie says, "Congratulations, Aaron. Thank you, but you won, so keep it." So I'm kind of looking for an update here. Whoever wants it, reach out to me and let me know. You will not be. It's $25 worth of fishing tackle. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. So Stephanie's been on a drop though.
Give it to Jacob. He says. I don't know who Jacob is.
Okay. I still think I'm going to give it to Stephanie, because that was original. She can use it. I saw her out on the water just the other day. So yeah. I think we're going with Stephanie. Stephanie, I think you're getting it regardless. So I'm making an executive decision right here. I'm gonna send it your way. I've got your information. I'll get it to you tomorrow. You don't have a choice now. Well, let's we try to go about 2 hours. We went 2 hours on this.
Okay.
Appreciate.
Does that count all of my technical screw ups?
Actually, it'd be 2 hours and 17 minutes. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Hey, we got it worked out fine though. Everything went well after
we're all smarter now because of it.
Yeah, because
when you have failures in life, you learn from your mistakes. Well, we all should learn from our mistakes, and we get better because of it.
Yeah. So the what was it? The anti-echo button or whatever. Yeah,
Right.
we'll know that next time when we have that issue with a guest.
Yeah, on the StreamYard app here, there's a little button that says more, and when I punched up that, then a thing that popped up that said something about anti-echo, and I turned it off.
And that was it. It's been flawless ever since.
There you go.
That's life. We're usually one small decision away from
greatness,
having a good day. Right. So, but yeah, we'll wrap this up, Gene. Man, thanks for hanging out. It was good to meet you and stuff.
No problem.
Keep doing the good work out there, and
well, thank you
sharing it. There's a lot of valuable information people can go back and listen to. Fish Care 101 for sure. It's something we all need to be mindful of.
I'll say, you know, our website, the bassmaster.com website. If you go to bassmaster.com/conservation-news, that's where you get to the stuff that we've got going on in the conservation world.
Okay.
I also run a Facebook group that's called B.A.S.S, B.A.S.S with the dots, Bass Conservation. And I try to post something on there every day if I can. And I share stuff from all over the internet when I find things that relate to bass fishing and conservation and biology, and just trying to share some information that hopefully, you know, help people take care of the resource a little bit better. But it's, you know, it's all out there for people if they want to look it up. And anybody wants to send me emails or, you know, has specific questions about lakes or fish management in their area, I'm more than willing to try to answer questions. And if I don't know the answers, chances are I know somebody that does. And I hopefully can point people in the right directions to get answers to questions that they have about what's going on in their particular lakes or their part of the country.
That's good to know. That's a good resource. I think you help out with some bass clubs too, right? If they need some assistance of not necessarily funding, but of, hey, what do we need to do to host a better lay-in? So.
Oh yeah. We definitely, you know, I don't have a problem at all in trying to, you know, help people. Like we said earlier, you know, taking little bits and pieces of the system that we've got at Bassmaster and breaking that down on how to make that work for your local bass club. I'd be glad to try to help with people on any of that.
Like this comment. Thanks for being, we're talking to Steph here because she's pretty outspoken about some topics on here, but thanks for being genuine in here. We disagree, but I respect your opinion. I think we need more of that in this world. We need people to be able to just speak their opinion in a respectful way and just agree, disagree if you don't like it. But we need, that's the only way anything gets solved, is putting it out there and just talking about it. So
be open-minded. That's right.
Be open-minded. That's right. So, all right, we're going to wrap this up. We do this every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. Hope to see you all next week. And tight lines.